Hey everyone. Welcome to this next GCSE booster lesson. Um, Again, the focus is paper 1A, Germany, from democracy to dictatorship. In this lesson, we are going to focus on Hitler's steps to power. I should start off by apologising for my voice. I haven't been very well, which is why this lesson is a bit late. I could barely talk yesterday. So the fact that I'm talking today is progress, so I hope you'll bear with me. Let's start with the checklist then. So what should you be able to explain? What should you be able to know about Hitler's steps to power? Well, first of all, of course, you're going to need to know about the impact of the economic depression and how we measure the impact of the depression on the growth in Nazi power through the Reichstag elections between 1930, 1932 and of course 1933. You'll need to be able to explain why the Nazis, rather than other right-wing political parties or left-wing political parties, were successful, and by doing that you'll need to focus on the appeal of Hitler, Nazi propaganda techniques, and of course the role of the SA. Then, of course, you'll need to have an understanding that ultimately Hitler was leveraged into power by von Papen and Hindenburg. The election results were not enough, so the deal to appoint Hitler Chancellor was very much brokered behind closed doors rather than in a general election. Stage two. So stage one covers, of course, Hitler's rise to Chancellor. Stage two, how does he go from being Chancellor to a dictator within just over a year? So you'll need to be able to explain the impact of the Reichstag fire and how that how Hitler used the Reichstag fire to convince Hindenburg to suspend the constitution and place Germany under a state of emergency. You'll then need to be able to explain the impact of the enabling bill, which of course enabled Hitler to bypass the normal democratic process and effectively rule by decree. And then you'll need to explain the importance of the Night of the Long Knives, how it enabled Hitler to eliminate his remaining enemies whilst brokering a deal with the army, which would ensure that he would become president upon the death of Hindenburg. So we're going to divide this lesson up into three parts. Part one, we're going to focus on content. We're going to focus on the impact of the Depression and how that turned the Nazis into a major political force so that Hitler was appointed Chancellor in 1933. We're then going to have a break. You're going to go away and write up your notes on that. Once you've done that, you'll hit play again on this video and we're going to look at stage two. How did Hitler consolidate and strengthen his position? How did he go from being a chancellor in a coalition government to being the out-and-out dictator of Germany by 1934? Again, once we've gone through that, you're going to pause the video and go away and do your mind maps or make your notes or however you prefer to work. You're going to go away and do that. Then you're going to hit play again. And the last part three, we're going to look at exam skills, and we're going to look at a 12-mark question on Hitler's consolidation of power, and with a specific focus this week on how we write substantiated judgments. So let's get started in part one. So we all know that the economic depression, which really began to impact the world between 1929 and 1930, was the turning point in the electoral success of the Nazi Party. It was a terrible global economic depression, of course, caused by the Wall Street crash. In Germany, because as we saw last week, the German recovery between 1924 and 1928 was largely based on borrowing. America had poured a significant amount of money into Germany. So when the American economy got into significant trouble, those loans were recalled. And the impact on Germany was catastrophic. So by 1932, we know that unemployment in Germany had risen to 6 million. The unemployment welfare scheme was insufficient. It couldn't handle the number of men and women out of work. And as a result of that, people lost their homes. They were living in, abject poverty. And we know that when people are living in those kind of conditions, support for extreme political parties begins to rise. So there were bankruptcies, redundancies, businesses collapsed, banks slammed their doors shut. And so in that, in that context, the extreme political parties, so the Nazis and the communists, begin to do very, very well in the elections. What we also see at this point is the Weimar government, they are completely ill-equipped to deal with the crisis. Chancellor Brüning repeatedly had to ask President Hindenburg to invoke Article 48 in order to bypass the Reichstag, in order to try to tackle the crisis. So Germany is already on this slide to dictatorship even before Hitler has come to power. Brüning's policies were largely unspectacular. They didn't work. They were unpopular, such as calling in unemployment pay, and what became clear to the German electorate was that this Weimar democracy was not equipped to deal with the severity of the global depression. So what you have on this slide, of course, are the election results from 1924 to 1933. What we're interested in, of course, are the election results between September of 1930 and March of 1933. So in 1930, as the crisis was really beginning to bite, Chancellor Brüning dissolves the Reichstag. He calls a fresh election with the hope that he'll win a big enough majority in order to be able to better easily implement his laws through the Reichstag and tackle the economic crisis. But it is a catastrophic mistake. Now you go back to 1928, the last election, you can see that the Nazis had just 12 seats in the German Reichstag, the German parliament, which amounted to around about 2.6% of the vote. In September of 1930, their seats in the Reichstag have gone up to 107. This is an astonishing turnaround. Now, as you can see, 2 years later, there was another election, and this time the Nazis have become the largest party in the Reichstag, scooping an incredible 230 seats, which amounted to 37.4% of the vote. So at that point, because Hitler is the leader of the largest party in the Reichstag, President Hindenburg, by rights, should have appointed Hitler Chancellor. He doesn't. He appoints von Papen. Now, as a result of the Nazis winning such a huge amount of seats in the Reichstag, they are now in a position to become a significant obstacle to democracy. And von Papen simply couldn't get any bill passed through the Reichstag. So another election is called just a few months later in November 1932. And as you can see, the Nazi vote has declined somewhat, but they are still the largest party in the Reichstag with 196 seats. Again, at this point, President Hindenburg should have appointed Hitler Chancellor. He doesn't, and he appoints instead one of his old army buddies, Colonel von Schleicher. The next election, in March of 1933, was called after Hitler had been appointed Chancellor. And as you can see, the Nazi vote goes up this time to 288 seats, which gives him around 43.9% of the vote. So, yes, they over 50% of the German electorate haven't voted for the Nazi Party, but of course, you have to understand how the proportional representation system works. It's very different from the British electoral system where we have winner takes all, first past the post. So in that context, to have won 288 seats in a proportional representation system is actually a very, very significant result. Well, we'll come back in a minute as to why Hitler called another election after he'd become appointed Chancellor, and how he became to be appointed Chancellor. Of course, you're going to need to know about why the German electorate were voting for the National Socialist Party. It's not enough simply to say it was the Depression. It was the Depression, of course, but there were other extreme parties out there like the Communists. There were other right-wing parties as well. So what was it that made the Nazis so appealing? This is when you're going to need to know about Hitler's appeal. He was a brilliant orator, a brilliant speaker. He travelled up and down the country. He was taken up and down the country by plane, so he very much looked like this modern statesman. His speeches were very powerful, but as per Nazi propaganda, they simply kind of focused on slogans and very simple themes, and it was a case of repeating those themes over and over again. Hitler understood the German electorate, the electorate in general, people in general, are far more likely to respond to emotion than detailed manifestos and policies. So they kept things simple, and they used repetitive slogans. Now, this is a modern electioneering technique. We see this all the time today in presidential elections in America and parliamentary elections here in the UK. But this was, of course, brand new at the time. And it was very effective. So they kept things simple. They were saying exactly what they'd been saying 10 years earlier. The Treaty of Versailles was a crime. The Jews were to blame. Hitler would make Germany great again. It's just, given the economic circumstances, people were now more willing to listen. The Nazis, of course, also had their own private army, the SA, to not only intimidate the opposition, but also to portray this sense of strength and order. And that was very important as well. So it's also, for those of you who really want to go for those higher grades, I would suggest it's also worth writing about Hitler's challenge for the presidency in 1932, Hitler probably knew he had no real chance of winning the presidential election. But if he were to attract millions of voters, as of course he did, then that would increase his bid for the chancellorship, the second most important job. So in July 1932, as we've seen, the Nazis became the biggest party in the Reichstag. By rights, Hitler should have been appointed the chancellor. So Hitler stands against Hindenburg in the presidential elections of that year. Now, Hindenburg scooped 17 million votes, far more than Hitler's 11 million votes, but nevertheless, the fact that 11 million people had voted for Hitler to be the head of state, the president, now legitimized Hitler's claim for the number 2 position, so it strengthened his claim to be chancellor. So as we've seen, we had the Nazis scooping the largest number of seats in the Reichstag in July and November of 1932, but in each case, President Hindenburg appoints von Papen chancellor and then, of course, von Schleicher, when really it should have been Hitler. Now, by January of 1933, Hindenburg has appointed Hitler the chancellor. So what happens in that 2 months between November of 1932 and January of 1933? Now, this is the period of what historians call backstairs intrigue. Hitler was leveraged into power. So what happens is very simple. Von Papen is furious that Hindenburg has replaced him as chancellor with von Schleicher. So von Papen concocts this plot to try to leverage himself back into power. And so he approaches Hindenburg with the idea of using Hitler and the Nazis, using the support that they have in the Reichstag, to leverage Hitler into the position of chancellor with just 2 other Nazis in a mostly conservative coalition, with von Papen positioned as Hitler's handler, as vice-chancellor, because they believed that they could control him. And von Papen suggested that this was the only way to get democracy working again, because the Nazis had such huge support and had such a vast majority in the Reichstag. So the idea was to put Hitler in as chancellor with just 2 other Nazis in a coalition government consisting mostly of conservatives, with von Papen effectively controlling Hitler's strings. And they believed that this would enable German democracy to get going again and would enable them to tackle the worst effects of the Depression without the Nazis presenting any obstacles in the Reichstag. Now, Hindenburg eventually, after a lot of persuasion, goes along with this, and Hitler is duly appointed the chancellor of a conservative-dominated coalition government on the 31st of January 1933. It turned out to be the biggest mistake of von Papen's career, because it would become absolutely obvious that Hitler was not going to be controlled in this way. So, I'd like you to pause the video now, and for 15 minutes or so, write a summary of how Hitler was appointed the Chancellor of Germany by 1933. So you'll need to focus on the impact of the Depression, how that led to a huge increase in Nazi support in the Reichstag, the electioneering techniques, the propaganda, the role of Hitler, and ultimately how Hitler was leveraged into power behind closed doors by von Papen and Hindenburg. Again, set your work out in any way you wish, whether you want to do a mind map or flashcards, or bulleted notes under subheadings. It's entirely up to you. You work in the way that works best for you. So allow yourself about 20 minutes, and when you've finished, hit play again on the video. Okay, welcome back. So, part 2, how did Hitler become the dictator of Germany by 1934? So we've just seen that Hitler was leveraged into power by von Papen, by Hindenburg, that he was the Chancellor, in other words, Prime Minister of a coalition government that consisted really of only 2 other Nazis, and which was dominated by more traditional conservative politicians. So how did Hitler release the shackles? How did he go from being what was effectively a puppet chancellor controlled by von Papen to being the Führer, the ruler of Germany, the head of state? And it's a fascinating story. And it all starts with the events of the Reichstag fire of the 27th of February 1933. So 1 week before the March elections, the very symbol of democracy, the Reichstag building, the parliament, the German parliament building, burned down. So the first thing that Hitler did when he became chancellor was to call a fresh election, because now as the chancellor of Germany and being able to use all of the resources of state, he believed that he would be able to win the majority he needed so that he could pass his measures through the Reichstag unimpeded. So effectively he was looking for a 2/3 majority. So 1 week before that election took place, the Reichstag mysteriously burned down. Hitler and the Nazis immediately proclaimed that it was a communist conspiracy, a communist act of terrorism. A Dutch communist by the name of Maurits van der Lubbe was arrested on site, and he was later executed. And this was enough for Hitler to persuade President Hindenburg to invoke Article 48 of the Constitution to suspend the Constitution and democracy and pass what became known as the Emergency Decree for the protection of the German people. So this created the foundation of the Nazi dictatorship. It suspended the Constitution. It suspended specific articles of the Constitution, such as freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of speech. And it justified the creation of the state police, the Gestapo. It justified the creation of the very first concentration camps. It allowed the Nazis to ban the Communist Party, to arrest thousands of their opponents. So this was the beginning of the dictatorship. In conjunction with that, Hindenburg is also persuaded to allow Hitler to put an enabling bill before the Reichstag. So the Reichstag will now meet in the Kroll Opera House whilst the actual Reichstag building was being repaired. And in the end, it was just the Socialist Party, the SPD, that voted against the passage of the enabling bill. The vote for the enabling bill was done in an atmosphere of intimidation and terror. SA stormtroopers lined the walls, and so there was a great deal of coercion. Many promises were made as well. Hitler promised, for example, the Catholic Centre Party who voted in favour of the bill, he promised them that he would not interfere in church affairs. Many promises were made. So in the end, the enabling bill is passed. Only the SPD voted against it. And this now gave Hitler the power of decree. It enabled Hitler to bypass the Reichstag and simply pass laws into effect. Now, all the other chancellors up until this point have failed to tackle the economic crisis because they couldn't get the Reichstag to agree or vote in favour of their bills. Hitler does not have that issue now. He can simply dictate laws into effect. So the Reichstag would really only meet now to listen to Hitler. It simply became not even a facilitator of legislation. They simply gathered to listen to Hitler speak and to pass laws. So the enabling bill gives Hitler these broad sweeping powers, and so he begins to use those powers. First things he does is to close down the trade unions. In July of 1933, he banned the existence of all other political parties bar the Nazi party, so now Germany is a one-party state. He then abolishes the state governments and replaces them with regional governors, who of course are completely loyal to Hitler. So it's fair to say, as a result of the Reichstag fire, as a result of the Enabling Act, Germany is now a one-party state. It's a dictatorship controlled by Adolf Hitler. Now, Hitler's position still isn't secure. He is still the Chancellor. He's not the head of state yet. President Hindenburg is still the president. And what begins to happen is that the SA, during this time, begins to get a little bit out of control. Now, their leader, Ernst Röhm, was one of Hitler's closest associates, so he went back all the way to the very early years of the party. They were involved in the Munich Putsch together. And Röhm begins to challenge Hitler's authority. He says that Hitler's revolution hasn't gone far enough. There should be a second revolution. And this revolution was based very much on the kind of more socialist principles that the party was originally based upon. The SA are becoming a bit of an embarrassment to Hitler. They are threatening his image of legality. And as long as Hindenburg was president, Hitler could still be unseated. Now, Hindenburg is in very poor health at this point. And he has terminal cancer. And Hitler is adamant that there is only one person to succeed Hindenburg as a head of state, and that is himself. But he has to convince the army. He has to convince the traditional ruling elites that were loyal to the army. When you are the head of state, you are, of course, commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So Hitler had to win the trust and support of the old Prussian landowning class, the officer class, the senior army generals. And so he brokers a deal. He meets in secret with Blomberg and Fritsch, two very senior military generals, and he agrees to take care of the SA on the condition that the German army leadership endorse Hitler as the head of state upon Hindenburg's death. So he agrees to eliminate his stormtroopers, who have been loyal and with him from the very beginning. So this leads to the events of what's known as the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler convened a conference for all SA leadership. They were staying at a hotel, believing that the next day they were going to be taking part in this very important conference. Hitler uses the newly created black-clad Schutzstaffel, the SS, to arrest the SA leadership, round them up, and have them murdered. Some old political scores were also settled. Hitler also has von Schleicher, the man who pipped him to the chancellorship in November of 1932. He has him murdered as well. And this sent out a clear message that Hitler was quite capable of using legalized state violence, legalized murder, in order to get what he wanted. Rom is also eventually executed, one of Hitler's oldest comrades, going way back to the early years of the party. And Hitler is able to justify all of this because of the state of emergency that was still in effect from the events of the Reichstag fire. The dying Hindenburg writes a speech the next day congratulating Hitler for his actions and preventing a second revolution in Germany. And so what this means, of course, was that when Hindenburg finally died on the 2nd of August 1934, Hitler was able to merge the office of Chancellor with that of President to become the new head of state and adopt the title of Führer. So by August of 1934, the Nazi regime has been completely stabilized, and only an earthquake would unseat Hitler as leader. In the space of approximately a year and a half, Hitler has gone from being a puppet chancellor heading a coalition government to being an out-and-out dictator of Germany. So at this stage, I'd like you to pause the video, and I'd like you, just as you did in part one, using whatever learning method, learning style you want, to make a summary of how Hitler went from being a chancellor to the all-out dictator of Germany by August of 1934. You should give yourself about 20 minutes to do that. Okay, everyone, welcome back. So in the third and final part of this lesson, we are going to use all the knowledge that we've acquired, particularly in relation to Hitler's consolidation of power, and now apply it to a 12-mark bullet question. Okay, so with the 12-mark bullet question, your answer should be 3 paragraphs in length. Your first paragraph, of course, should deal with the first bullet that you're given. So in this case, the Reichstag fire. And in the context of the question, explain how the Reichstag fire enabled Hitler to consolidate, or that means to strengthen his position. Your second paragraph, you should then focus on the Night of the Long Knives, and again, explain how the Night of the Long Knives helped Hitler to consolidate or strengthen his position. So this question is really getting us to think about cause and consequence. Okay? So how did the Reichstag fire strengthen his position? Was this the most important reason for why Hitler was able to strengthen his position between 1933 to 1934? So let's have a think then. If we were planning that first paragraph, you would really need to think about the consequences of the Reichstag fire. In what ways did it strengthen Hitler's position? Well, as I've said here on the slide, as we know, it enabled Hitler to persuade President Hindenburg to declare a state of national emergency. As a result of that, with these new powers that were given to Hitler, it enabled him to ban the Communist Party and to arrest thousands of his nearest rivals. I mean, let's face it, there was an election taking place a week later. The Communists were, not far behind the Nazis in terms of the number of seats that they won in the Reichstag, and now they've been banned, and their members have been arrested. More broadly, of course, it enables the Nazis and Hitler to set up this whole apparatus of terror the state police, the Gestapo, were created. The first concentration camps were set up in makeshift warehouses in order to house the thousands of people that had been arrested. As a result, in the election, Hitler gains even more seats, really consolidating the Nazi grip in the Reichstag. Perhaps the most important, of course, is that this spectre of an irresponsible communist party that will prepare to use terrorism is probably enough to persuade most of the other political parties to give Hitler the powers of dictator in the Reichstag so that he can, simply pass laws without any debate or discussion. And through doing that, he's able to ban the opposition political parties. He's able to ban the workers' trade unions, and he's able to abolish the old state governments. So there's a lot we can really unpick in terms of the Reichstag fire and how it strengthened Hitler's position. Okay, so a really good answer here. What we don't want to do is fall into the trap of writing a narrative. I'm not interested really in, and then an examiner wouldn't be interested in a story of the Reichstag fire and what happened. What we're really interested in is cause and consequences. Okay, particularly the consequences of the fire. How did this strengthen Hitler's position? In your second paragraph, again, absolutely the same methodology needs to be used. Again, we're not interested in a story of the Night of the Long Knives. Okay, what we want to do is unpack the consequences so we can determine in terms of causation, what was the most important reason for Hitler's consolidation of power? What was the most important cause of Hitler, of his consolidation of power during this time? So, what were the consequences of the Night of the Long Knives? How did it strengthen Hitler's position? Well, we know as a result of that, the SA were rounded up and shot. They were removed, eliminated, and as a result, a second revolution that Röhm and the SA leadership have been calling for never happened. Hitler was also able to eliminate his significant political enemies, such as Ernst Röhm, such as von Schleicher. Crucially, he secured a personal oath of allegiance from the army, and so this paved the way of Hitler being able to, in the event of Hindenburg's death, being able to simply combine the position of Chancellor with the presidency and establish himself as the absolute ruler of Germany, the Führer. So that second paragraph must really, really unpack the consequences in it and explain, link the evidence, direct the evidence to the issue in the question. That's one of the fundamental skills that AQA are looking for. That we're not just talking about the consequences, but we are then explaining how the removal of the SA, how the personal oath of allegiance from the army, how did that strengthen Hitler's position? So we need to really direct the evidence, our consequences here, to the issue and the question, which is what was the most important reason for Hitler's consolidation of power? Now, what we need to do to break into the higher levels of the mark scheme for this question, to get into level 3 and into level 4, so that we are showing evidence not just of developed thinking, but complex thinking, is that our answer, as just previously discussed, is directly relevant to the question. So we are directing the evidence to the issue in the question, but that it is substantiated with evidence and that a substantiated judgment is reached. Now that substantiated judgment happens in the third paragraph, your conclusion. Okay? And that is probably, well, if you want to get to the very top levels of the mark scheme, that's the most important paragraph in your answer. So this is where often the really good level answers, as we discussed in the last lesson, we'll think about how the factors are connected and interrelated. So have a think. Would Hitler have been able to execute Röhm and the SA if he did not already possess the powers of a dictator? What he did in June of 1934 amounted to legalized murder. And he could only do that because of the emergency powers he possessed as a result of the Reichstag fire. So if you took away the Reichstag fire, if you took away the powers that gave him under the Protection for the German People, and then of course the powers he accrued under the Enabling Act, would he have been in a position to have eliminated his political enemies? So we're thinking of cause and effect here. Okay, so if we went back to the events of early 1933 and eliminated those events, so Hitler didn't have those emergency powers, would he have been able to get away with legalized murder in June 1934? And I think the conclusion that we come to quite sensibly was no, he wouldn't have been. The whole Nazi dictatorship was based upon that state of emergency that was declared after the 27th of February 1933. And it never went away. The whole 12 years of Nazi rule was based upon a constant state of emergency. It's not like the Nazis created a separate state apparatus. They didn't. It's just that the old Weimar Constitution was suspended indefinitely. So I think that's the answer to this question. I think, for this, yes, the Night of the Long Knives was very, very important. And there's no doubt whatsoever that Hitler would not have been able to ascend to the presidency, to head of state, to Führer, if he hadn't brokered this deal with the army to eliminate the SA. But equally, he would not have been able to commit mass murder on the scale that he did without the emergency powers that he was provided with back in February and March of 1933. And that is the type of thing you need to think about to make a convincing and fully substantiated judgment. How are the factors connected and interrelated? If we plot events in a sequence and we take some of those events away, would the course of history still play out the same? And of course we can come to the conclusion that they would not. Okay, that's pretty much it for this week. Okay, so we discussed in quite some depth a 12 marker last week. This week has been a little bit more focused on the conclusion and how we substantiate our judgments. I think it's very important to emphasize a good conclusion is not, in conclusion, I think that, one or two sentences. It's fully substantiated. You're demonstrating evidence of complex thinking. by explaining how, or at least showing an awareness of how the factors are connected and interrelated. And that will, if your first paragraph is fully explained and directed to the issue in the question, and likewise your second paragraph, then to show that evidence of complex thinking in your third paragraph, that will enable you to come to a substantiated judgment. That is going to get you into the top levels and will get you that top level answer. Okay, folks, that's it for this week. See you next time.